Ontology is the study of what exists, not what we believe exists or what we wish existed, but what the structure of reality actually contains. It asks questions so basic they sound almost childish. Are there objects out there, or just experiences in here? When two things share a colour, is that shared colour itself a real thing? Does the past still exist, or has it been annihilated by the present? When you walk into a room and find a chair, what exactly have you found? A bundle of atoms, a bundle of properties, a substance bearing qualities, or something else entirely? These questions are not academic decorations. Every scientific theory, every legal system, every piece of software quietly depends on answers to them. A physicist modelling particles assumes something about what a particle is. A database architect decides what counts as an entity and what counts as a relation. A court ruling on corporate liability assumes something about whether a group can act. Ontology is the hidden operating system underneath every other discipline. This series reconstructs the entire history of ontology from its origin to its open frontiers. We begin in ancient Greece, where the question of being first became explicit. We move through every major development, crisis and reinvention that followed. The goal is not to survey opinions, but to make you feel the pressure that forced each idea into existence. 35 parts. No shortcuts, no simplifications that sacrifice the actual argument. Every idea earns its place by solving a problem you will already understand when it arrives. Part 1. The question that refuses to stay settled. You open your front door in the morning and the world is just there. Trees, sidewalks, cars, sky. None of it seems to require explanation at the level of its sheer existence. It is simply present, and you move through it without a second thought. But take one step further and the solidity starts to crack. You look at your car and you call it one thing. A mechanic looks at it and sees thousands of parts. A physicist looks at it and sees a cloud of atoms that is mostly empty space. A tax assessor looks at it and sees a depreciating asset. Which of these is what the car actually is? You might say all of them, depending on your perspective. But that answer smuggles in a massive assumption. It assumes there is something underneath all these perspectives that each one captures partially. What is that underlying thing? Can you describe it without using any particular perspective? And if you cannot, does it make sense to say it is there at all? This is the entry point of ontology. The word comes from the Greek word for being, combined with the word for study. But ontology is not just a catalogue of what exists, the way a warehouse inventory lists its contents. It asks what it means for something to exist in the first place. It asks whether everything that exists does so in the same way. It asks whether the number 7 and your kitchen table share the same kind of reality. Here is a concrete case that shows why this matters beyond philosophy. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico. Courts had to determine whether BP, the corporation, caused the disaster. Not whether specific engineers made errors, but whether the company itself bore responsibility. That required an answer to an ontological question that no one in the courtroom would have called ontological. Can a corporation act? Is a corporation a real entity that does things, or just a legal shorthand for a group of people? If it is real, what kind of reality does it have? The judge could not dodge this. The legal framework demanded that either the corporation was the kind of thing that could cause events, or it was not. And whatever answer the court gave would ripple through liability law, insurance and regulation for decades. The most abstract question in philosophy, what kinds of things exist, had become a practical emergency. Ontology keeps doing this throughout history. Every time a civilization thinks it has settled the question, some new development forces it open again. Modern physics dissolved solid matter into fields and probabilities. Computer science required formal decisions about what counts as an object in a program. Artificial intelligence forced the question of whether a mind can exist without a body. The question of being is not one problem that gets solved. It is a question that each age must answer with the tools and pressures it actually faces. The first people to confront this question explicitly did so in a small corner of the ancient Mediterranean. What they discovered there was so strange that philosophy has never fully recovered from it. Part 2. Parmenides and the Shock of Being. Before ontology had a name, it had a crisis. In the early 5th century before the Common Era, Greek thinkers were already debating what the universe was made of. Some said water, some said air, some said fire. These proposals shared an assumption so obvious it seemed beyond challenge. Things change. Water becomes ice, wood becomes ash. The living become the dead. The task of the thinker was to explain how things change, not whether they do. Then a man from the Greek colony of Elea, named Parmenides, made an argument that should have been easy to dismiss, but turned out to be impossible to refute. He did not propose a new element or a new mechanism of change. He attacked the very idea of change itself, and he did it using pure logic. His reasoning ran as follows. For anything to change, it must go from being one way to being another way. But consider what that means at the most fundamental level. For something to come into existence, it must come from non-existence. In other words, it must come from nothing. But nothing is not a thing, not a place, not a source. Nothing, by definition, has no properties and no capacity to produce anything, so nothing cannot give rise to something. Run the logic in the other direction. For something to go out of existence, it must become nothing. But you cannot arrive at a destination that is not there. If non-being has no reality, then nothing can transition into it. The conclusion follows with uncomfortable rigour. What exists has always existed, and will always exist. It cannot have come from anywhere, and it cannot go anywhere. There is no such thing as coming to be or passing away. Change is an illusion. The universe is one, unchanging, undivided, and eternal. Think about how radical this is. A person tosses a log on a campfire and watches it burn to ash. Parmenides says that what just happened did not really happen. The apparent transformation is a trick of the senses, not a fact about reality. Reality, what he called being, is whole, complete, and motionless. Our perception of change is a kind of cosmic error. You encounter a version of this problem every time you think seriously about conservation laws in physics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. The total quantity of something fundamental remains constant through every apparent change. Modern physicists would not put it in Parmenides' terms, but the structural pattern is the same. Underneath all apparent flux, something persists. The question is what that something is, and whether the flux is real or derivative. Parmenides forced every thinker who came after him into a dilemma. Either accept his logic and deny the reality of change, which contradicts everything you observe, or reject his conclusion and show exactly where his reasoning breaks down, which nobody could do cleanly. The history of ontology is, in one sense, a 2,000-year response to this dilemma. But Parmenides was not the only radical voice in his generation. At almost exactly the same time, another Greek thinker was reaching the opposite extreme. Part 3. Heraclitus and the Crisis of Change. While Parmenides argued that nothing ever changes, a thinker in the city of Ephesus named Heraclitus was arguing something almost perfectly opposed. For Heraclitus, change was not an illusion to be explained away. Change was the fundamental nature of reality itself. Permanence was the illusion. His most famous image captures the point precisely. You step into a river. The water flowing past your ankles right now is not the water that was there a moment ago. New water has arrived, and the old water has moved downstream. In what sense is it the same river? If everything that composes the river has been replaced, the identity of the river is not grounded in its material. The river is not a thing. It is a pattern of continuous flow. Now extend this to everything. Your body replaces almost all of its cells over the course of several years. The atoms in your hand today are not the atoms that were there a decade ago. If Heraclitus is right, then you are not a stable object persisting through time. You are a process, a pattern that maintains its shape while its material constantly cycles through. This is not just a poetic observation. It carries a severe ontological consequence. If the basic nature of reality is flux, then stable objects are a kind of abstraction that our minds impose on the flow. We call something a table because we freeze the flux into a snapshot and give it a name. But the table is aging. Its molecules are vibrating. Its wood is slowly decaying. The snapshot is never perfectly still. Heraclitus went further. He claimed that this constant change was not random, but governed by an underlying principle he called the logos. The logos was the rational order or pattern within the flux. Fire was his favoured image for it, always burning, always consuming, always transforming, yet maintaining a recognizable structure. Reality was not chaos. It was ordered change. Here is a place where this ancient debate is already operating in your life without your knowing it. Every piece of software that models real-time systems faces the Heraclitean problem directly. A weather simulation needs to represent the atmosphere, but the atmosphere never holds still. The model must decide, does it capture the state at an instant, or does it capture the process of change itself? These are two fundamentally different design choices, and they yield different predictions. The Parmenides approach freezes reality into static states and then sequences them. The Heraclitus approach treats the dynamics as primary and derives the states from them. Now you can see the crisis that defined early ontology. Parmenides said being is one and unchanging, and logic supports him. Heraclitus said reality is ceaseless flux, and observation supports him. Logic and observation appeared to be at war. Any adequate ontology would need to honour both, the logical demand for something stable and the observed fact of change. And that is exactly the problem that the next great thinker set out to solve. Part 4. Plato's Forms and the World Behind the World. The tension between Parmenides and Heraclitus left Greek thought with an impossible choice. Accept that change is real and lose the logical coherence of being. Accept that being is unchanging and lose the entire observable world. Plato, working in Athens roughly a century later, refused both options. His solution was to argue that both sides were right, but about different things. Here is the observation that drove him there. Consider what happens when a geometer draws a circle on a piece of papyrus. The drawn circle is imperfect. The line wavers, the curve is slightly uneven. Yet the geometer knows exactly what a perfect circle is. The knowledge does not come from the drawing, because the drawing fails to match it. Where does the knowledge of the perfect circle come from? Plato's answer was that there exists a perfect circle itself, not in the physical world, but in a separate realm. This perfect circle is what he called a form. The drawn circle on papyrus participates in or imitates the form of the circle. The form is eternal, unchanging, and fully real in the way Parmenides demanded. The physical drawing is changing, imperfect, and only partially real in the way Heraclitus described. This was not limited to geometry. Every general quality, justice, beauty, equality, redness, had its own form. When you call two different sunsets beautiful, you are recognizing something they share. That shared something, on Plato's account, is not just a word or a habit of thought. It is a real entity, the form of beauty, that both sunsets imperfectly reflect. The ontological move here is dramatic. Plato split reality into two layers. The upper layer consists of the forms, perfect, eternal, unchanging, accessible only through reason. The lower layer is the physical world, imperfect, constantly changing, accessible through the senses. The physical world depends on the forms for whatever reality it has. A beautiful thing is beautiful because it participates in the form of beauty, not the other way around. This solves the Parmenides-Heraclitus dilemma in one stroke. Being, in the fullest sense, belongs to the unchanging forms. Parmenides was right about that realm. Change belongs to the physical world of appearances. Heraclitus was right about this one. Neither thinker was wrong. Each was describing a different layer of a two-tiered reality. You can see a version of this operating whenever scientists distinguish between a law and its instances. The law of gravity is the same everywhere and at all times. But every particular falling apple is different. Different mass, different height, different air resistance. The law is like a Platonic form, universal and unchanging. The individual cases are like the physical world, variable and imperfect embodiments of that law. When a physicist says the law is more fundamental than any particular case, they are echoing Plato's structure, whether they know it or not. But there is a problem, and Plato himself seems to have recognized it. If the form of beauty is a separate thing from beautiful objects, what connects them? Plato used the word participation, but that is a metaphor, not an explanation. How does a physical sunset participate in an abstract form? What is the mechanism of participation? This is not a minor loose end. It is a structural flaw that threatens to make the forms useless for explaining anything about the physical world. There is a further difficulty, sometimes called the third man problem. If a tall person is tall because they participate in the form of tallness, then consider both the person and the form together. They share something in common, tallness. By Plato's own logic, this shared quality requires a further form to explain it. And that further form creates the same problem again, requiring yet another form. The explanation generates an infinite chain that never reaches a foundation. Plato's greatest student saw these difficulties clearly and built an entirely new ontology to overcome them. Part 5. Aristotle brings ontology down to earth. Plato's two-world ontology explained universality, but at a cost. It left the relationship between the forms and physical things dangerously unclear. Aristotle, who studied under Plato for 20 years, thought the solution was not to repair the bridge between the two worlds, but to reject the separation entirely. His starting observation was simple and devastating. If the form of horse is what makes each horse a horse, then the form must contain everything essential to being a horse. But the form of horse is not itself a horse. It does not eat, breathe, or gallop. So how can something that lacks all the activities of a horse be what explains horses? The explanatory thing must be in the horse, not floating in a separate realm. This led Aristotle to a concept that would dominate ontology for 2,000 years: substance. A substance is a concrete individual thing that exists in its own right. This particular oak tree, this particular horse, this particular person. Substances are not reducible to bundles of qualities or shadows of abstract forms. They are the primary realities. Everything else, colours, shapes, sizes, relationships, exists only by being attached to substances. Think of it through a concrete case. You are looking at a red apple on a kitchen counter. The redness does not float freely in the world. It exists as the redness of this apple. The roundness is the roundness of this apple. Remove the apple, and the redness and roundness have nowhere to be. The apple is the substance. The redness and roundness are what Aristotle called accidents, properties that depend on the substance for their existence. But substances are not featureless lumps. Each substance has two aspects that Aristotle called matter and form. The matter of a bronze statue is the bronze itself. The form of the statue is its shape, its structure, the pattern that makes it a statue rather than a lump. Here is the critical move. The form is not in a separate Platonic realm. It is right there in the bronze, organizing it into this particular thing. Form and matter are not two things glued together. They are two aspects of one single substance, distinguishable in thought, but inseparable in reality. This framework gave Aristotle something Plato could not provide, a coherent account of change. When a seed becomes a tree, the matter persists while the form changes. The stuff that composed the seed is now organized differently as the tree. Change is real, not illusory, because it is the reorganization of matter under a new form. But something persists through the change, the underlying matter. So Parmenides' demand for continuity is also met. Aristotle organized all of reality into a system of categories. Substance was the primary category, the one everything else depends on. Then came quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, possession, action, and passion. These categories were supposed to capture every possible way something could be said to exist. Together they formed the first comprehensive map of being ever attempted. You already use something like this system whenever you fill out a structured database. A database has fields for a primary entity, a customer, say, and then attributes attached to that entity. The customer is the substance. Their name, age, and address are accidents. The structure assumes that reality consists of individual things with properties, exactly as Aristotle proposed. Relational databases are, in effect, applied Aristotelian ontology. But there is a deep problem hiding in the form-matter framework. Aristotle said that the form of a horse is what makes it a horse. And that form is universal. All horses share the same form. But the individual horse is also supposed to be the primary reality. So, what makes this horse different from that horse if they share the same form? The answer must lie in the matter. But matter, for Aristotle, is what receives form. It has no character of its own until it is organized. So we are explaining individuality through something that has, by definition, no individual features. This tension between the universality of form and the individuality of substance would become the single most divisive problem in medieval philosophy. Part 6. The Medieval War over Universals. Aristotle had placed universal forms inside individual things rather than in a separate Platonic heaven. But this created a puzzle that would consume European philosophy for centuries. The puzzle is deceptively simple to state. When you say that two horses are both horses, you are applying a universal concept, horse, to two distinct individuals. The question is, does that universal exist as a real thing in the world? Or is it just a word we use to group similar things together? This is not a question about language preferences. The answer determines the fundamental structure of reality. If universals are real, then the world contains not just individual objects, but also shared natures, essences, and kinds. If universals are not real, then the world contains only particular things, and our general concepts are mental inventions imposed on a world that does not share them. Three major positions emerged in medieval Europe. The first was realism about universals, and its strongest defenders drew on Plato and Aristotle. Realists held that universals genuinely exist. The nature horse is a real thing, present in each individual horse, not just a label we invented. When a veterinarian says that horses are mammals, they are stating a fact about a real universal nature, not just describing a useful filing system. The second position was nominalism, and its most forceful champion was a 14th-century English friar named William of Ockham. Ockham argued that only individual things exist. The word horse is a term in language that we apply to many individuals because they resemble each other. But there is no single thing, no shared nature, no universal horseness, sitting out in the world or inside each horse. The universal exists only in the mind and in speech, never in reality. Ockham's reasoning came from a principle that now bears his name, often called Ockham's razor. Do not multiply entities beyond what is necessary to explain the phenomena. We can explain why we call many things horse without positing a mysterious universal entity. We call them horse because they are similar to each other. The similarity is enough. The universal adds nothing, and so should be cut away. A third position tried to split the difference. Conceptualism, defended by thinkers like Peter Abelard in the 12th century, held that universals exist as concepts in the mind. They are not mere words, because our concepts do track real similarities, but they are not independent things in the world either. The universal is a mental act of grouping, grounded in real resemblance, but not itself a piece of furniture in reality. You can see this debate replaying itself in a modern biology lab. A taxonomist classifies an organism as a member of a particular species. Is that species a real thing in nature, a kind that the organism belongs to regardless of whether anyone studies it? Or is the species a convenient grouping that biologists impose on a continuum of genetic variation? The debate between biological realists and biological conventionalists recapitulates the medieval problem almost exactly, and it has practical consequences. Conservation laws protect species, so whether a population counts as a distinct species can determine whether it lives or dies. The medieval debate never reached a clean resolution, and its echoes continue today in every discipline that uses categories. But one medieval thinker pushed the ontological question in a direction that neither the universals debate nor Aristotle's categories had fully explored. He asked not what a thing is, but why it exists at all. Part 7. Aquinas and the Gap Between Essence and Existence. Aristotle's ontology was a system of what things are. It classified substances, described their forms, mapped their properties into categories. But it treated the existence of things as almost self-evident. A horse exists, and our job is to understand what it is to be a horse. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar writing in the 13th century, identified a profound gap in this approach. Knowing what something is does not tell you whether it exists. Consider a specific case. You can describe a unicorn in perfect detail. Single horn, equine body, cloven hooves. You can specify its essence completely, but that specification does not make one appear in the stable. The essence of a unicorn and the existence of a unicorn are two entirely separate matters. You can have the first without the second. Aquinas made this the centerpiece of his ontology. In every created thing, he argued, there is a real distinction between what it is, its essence, and the fact that it is, its existence. Essence and existence are not just two ways of thinking about a thing. They are two real components that are combined in every existing thing. This distinction has more force than it might initially seem. It means that no created thing exists necessarily. The essence of a horse does not contain its own existence, the way the essence of a triangle contains having three sides. A horse could perfectly well not exist. The same goes for every individual thing, every species, every star. Nothing about what they are guarantees that they are. Then where does existence come from? If no thing's essence explains its own existence, something outside it must supply that existence. Aquinas argued that there must be one being whose essence is existence, a being that does not have existence added to it, but simply is existing. This being he identified with God. In this framework, God is not just the most powerful being or the creator of the universe in a temporal sense. God is the being in which essence and existence are identical, and everything else receives its existence from that source. You do not need to accept the theological conclusion to see the philosophical power of the distinction. The gap between essence and existence shows up everywhere in modern thought, though under different names. In logic, there is a standard distinction between a definition and an existence claim. You can define a set with specific properties without those properties guaranteeing that any such set actually exists. Mathematicians discovered in the early 20th century that some perfectly coherent definitions describe things that cannot exist, like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The gap between what a thing would be and whether it is turns out to be central to the foundations of mathematics. In product design, the same gap appears when engineers distinguish between a specification and a prototype. The specification describes what the product is. The prototype demonstrates that it can be. Many specifications that look coherent on paper turn out to be unrealizable in practice. The gap between essence and existence is not just medieval theology. It is a structural feature of how we think about possibility and reality. But Aquinas was still working within a broadly Aristotelian framework, refining the relationship between categories of being. The next seismic shift in ontology came when a thinker in the 17th century decided to doubt everything and rebuild from scratch. Part 8. Descartes splits reality in two. By the early 17th century, the Aristotelian framework had dominated European thought for roughly 400 years. Substances, forms, essences and categories provided the vocabulary for nearly every intellectual project. Then René Descartes, a French mathematician and philosopher, performed an experiment in radical doubt that shattered this entire structure and replaced it with something far stranger. Descartes' starting point was epistemological, not ontological. He was asking what we can know, not what exists. But the answer to the first question forced a dramatic answer to the second. He resolved to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. He rejected the evidence of his senses because senses sometimes deceive. He rejected the existence of the physical world because he might be dreaming. He even considered the possibility that a powerful deceiver was feeding him false experiences of everything. But he found one thing that survived every attempt at doubt. The very act of doubting proved that something was doing the doubting. If he was thinking, even if every thought was wrong, the existence of the thinker was certain. This is the famous conclusion. I think, therefore I am. The ontological consequence was immediate and enormous. What Descartes had proven to himself was the existence of a thinking thing, a mind. He had not proven the existence of a body, a brain, or any physical object. The mind was known with certainty. The body was still under doubt. This meant that the mind and the body were at least conceptually separable. You could coherently assert the existence of one while denying the existence of the other. Descartes then argued that this conceptual separability reflected a real ontological division. Reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of substance. There is thinking substance, mind, consciousness, thought, which has no spatial extension and occupies no physical location. And there is extended substance, matter, bodies, physical things, which occupies space but does not think. These two substances have nothing in common. Mind is not a subtle form of matter, and matter is not a crude form of mind. They are ontologically distinct in the strongest possible sense. This dualism solved certain problems elegantly. It gave the new mathematical physics of his era a clean domain. The physical world was pure extension, fully describable by geometry and mechanics. It preserved a space for the soul, free will, and moral responsibility that purely physical explanations might threaten. And it matched a common intuition. Your experience of seeing red feels like a fundamentally different kind of thing from the light waves that cause it. But it created a devastating new problem. If mind and matter are utterly different kinds of substance with nothing in common, how do they interact? When you decide to raise your arm, a mental event, your decision, must somehow cause a physical event, your arm moving. When you step on a thorn, a physical event, tissue damage, must somehow cause a mental event, the feeling of pain. Causation seems to require some shared medium, some common ground between cause and effect. Descartes' dualism eliminated exactly that common ground. This is called the mind-body problem, and every attempt to solve it defines a different ontological position. Descartes himself suggested that the interaction happened in the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain. But this was no solution at all. It just relocated the mystery to a smaller piece of matter. How does a non-physical mind interact with the pineal gland any more easily than with the whole body? You encounter the mind-body problem every time you take a painkiller. A physical pill alters the chemistry of your brain and changes your conscious experience of pain. That routine fact requires that matter can influence mind. If you have ever felt anxious and noticed your heart racing, mind appears to influence matter. The entire practice of medicine assumes constant two-way traffic between the mental and the physical. Descartes' ontology makes this traffic theoretically impossible, while it obviously happens every second of every day. One of the most ambitious responses to this problem came from a thinker who agreed with Descartes about almost nothing except the importance of getting ontology right. Part 9. Spinoza's radical answer, one substance. Descartes left philosophy with two separate kinds of substance and no way to connect them. Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch Jewish lens grinder writing in the mid-17th century, saw this not as a problem to be patched, but as a sign that the whole framework was wrong. His response was to dismantle substance dualism at its root and replace it with the most extreme form of monism in the history of philosophy. Spinoza began with a definition of substance that Descartes himself would have accepted. A substance is something that exists in itself and is conceived through itself. It does not depend on anything else for its existence or its explanation. Descartes had said there were two such things, mind and matter, plus God who created them both. Spinoza noticed a contradiction in this picture. If mind and matter each depend on God for their existence, then they are not truly self-sufficient. By the very definition Descartes accepted, they fail to qualify as substances. The only thing that genuinely exists in itself and depends on nothing else is God, or equivalently, nature as a whole. There is only one substance. This single substance is not a remote creator who made the world and stepped back. The single substance is the world. Spinoza identified God with nature, using the famous phrase, God or nature, to indicate that these are two names for the same reality. Everything that exists is a mode, a particular way of being, of this one substance. Your mind and your body are not two separate things interacting. They are two aspects of one and the same event, seen from different angles. Think of a cylinder casting shadows on two walls at right angles. On one wall the shadow is a circle. On the other wall it is a rectangle. If you only saw the shadows, you might think there were two different objects, one circular, one rectangular. You would wonder how they stayed perfectly coordinated. But there are not two objects. There is one object appearing in two different projections. For Spinoza, mind and body work exactly this way. They are not two interacting substances, but two attributes of one substance. Thought and extension are two ways the single substance expresses itself. When you make a decision and your arm moves, there is no mysterious causal bridge needed. There was only ever one event describe mentally as a decision and physically as a movement. This dissolves the mind-body problem completely, but at an enormous cost. If everything is one substance, then individual things lose their independence. You and I are not separate substances. We are temporary patterns, modes of the one infinite substance, like waves on a single ocean. Free will, in the ordinary sense of an individual choosing independently, becomes impossible. A wave does not choose its direction. The ocean's currents determine it. Spinoza accepted this consequence fully and without flinching. He argued that what we call free will is just ignorance of the causes that determine us. A stone thrown through the air, if it were conscious, would think it was flying of its own accord. We are that stone, conscious of our motion, but blind to the forces that launched us. This position appears in modern thought more often than is usually acknowledged. Every time a neuroscientist argues that a brain scan reveals a decision was made before the person was aware of choosing, they are operating in Spinoza's territory. The claim is not just that brain states cause mental states. It is that what we experience as a free choice and what the scan shows as neural activity are the same event, described in two vocabularies. But Spinoza's monism raises its own problem. If there is only one substance and everything is a mode of it, what accounts for the apparent diversity and structure of the world? Why does reality organize itself into rocks and rivers and people rather than being an undifferentiated blob? Spinoza addressed this through his account of how modes relate to each other and to the whole. But his contemporary and rival had a very different answer, an ontology that multiplied substances to infinity. Part 10. Leibniz, Monads, and the Seeds of Possible Worlds. Spinoza collapsed all of reality into one substance. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German polymath working at the same time, moved in the opposite direction. Where Spinoza saw unity, Leibniz saw infinite plurality. Leibniz started from a problem with the physics of his day. Matter, as Descartes and others described it, was extended stuff. It filled space and could be divided into smaller and smaller pieces. But if you keep dividing, you never reach a natural stopping point. Any piece of matter, no matter how small, can, in principle, be divided again. This means extended matter has no ultimate building blocks. It is infinitely divisible, and that means it has no real foundation. A pile of sand is not a true unity. It is just many grains sitting together. Each grain is not a true unity either. It is just many molecules. If you keep going and never reach something that is a genuine unity, then the whole pile lacks ontological grounding. There must be, Leibniz argued, simple substances that are not composed of parts. These are the true atoms of reality, not physical atoms, which still have extension and can be divided, but metaphysical points of unity. He called them monads. Monads are strange entities. Each monad is a simple, indivisible substance with no spatial parts. It has no windows, as Leibniz famously put it, meaning nothing enters or leaves it from outside. Each monad contains within itself the entire basis for everything that will ever happen to it. Its future states unfold from its inner nature the way a mathematical function unfolds its values from its definition. Then, how do monads produce the world we see? If each monad is sealed off from every other, how do we get the appearance of interaction, of trees affecting light and light affecting eyes? Leibniz's answer was pre-established harmony. God, in creating the monads, set each one's inner program so that they would all unfold in perfect coordination. No monad ever truly acts on another. Each runs its own internal sequence, and the sequences match perfectly, like synchronized clocks that were wound at the same time. This sounds extravagant, but it solved a real problem that plagued both Descartes and Spinoza. Descartes could not explain how mind and body interact. Spinoza eliminated the problem by eliminating the distinction. Leibniz kept the distinction. Each monad has its own inner life, its own perspective, but explained the coordination without requiring direct causal contact. Leibniz also introduced a concept that would become enormously important centuries later: possible worlds. He argued that God, before creating anything, surveyed all logically possible configurations of monads, all the ways a universe could be arranged. Among these infinitely many possible worlds, God chose the best one to make actual. Our world, with all its apparent imperfections, is the best possible combination of variety and order. The idea of possible worlds might seem like theological speculation, but it became a precision tool in 20th century logic. When modern philosophers analyze what it means to say something is necessary or possible, they do so using a framework of possible worlds that descends directly from Leibniz. A statement is necessarily true if it holds in all possible worlds. A statement is possibly true if it holds in at least one possible world. This framework is now standard in logic, linguistics, and computer science. Leibniz planted the seed. The 20th century grew the tree. But the monad theory had a vulnerability that its successors would exploit ruthlessly. Leibniz built his ontology on the concept of substance, simple, indivisible, self-sufficient units of reality. The next movement in ontology would ask whether the concept of substance can survive close examination at all. Part 11. The Empiricist Demolition of Substance. By the early 18th century, ontology had been built almost entirely on the concept of substance. Parmenides had posited unchanging being, Aristotle had given it structure, and the rationalists had debated how many substances existed. Then a series of British and Irish philosophers turned the question around. Instead of asking what substances are, they asked whether we have any reason to believe in substances at all. The attack began with John Locke in the late 17th century. Locke was not hostile to the idea of substance, but he was honest about what we actually experience. When you perceive an apple, you perceive redness, roundness, sweetness, and firmness. Each of these is a quality. But the substance, the thing that holds these qualities together, is never itself directly experienced. Locke called it a something I know not what, a mysterious support for properties that we can never observe directly. This is already uncomfortable, but it was George Berkeley, an Irish bishop who pushed the logic further. Berkeley argued that material substance is not just unknown, it is incoherent. Everything we call a physical object is exhausted by the qualities we perceive, its colour, texture, taste, shape, sound. Strip away all the perceived qualities and ask what is left. The supposed material substance behind them is, Berkeley argued, literally nothing at all. We invented an invisible substratum and then forgot that we invented it. Berkeley did not conclude that things do not exist. He concluded that to exist is to be perceived. The apple exists as a collection of sensory ideas in a mind. No apple. God's mind serves as the permanent perceiver that keeps the world in existence when no human is looking. This sounds wild, but Berkeley argued it was simply the honest consequence of taking experience seriously. David Hume, a Scottish philosopher of the next generation, completed the demolition with characteristic rigour. Hume applied a single test to every metaphysical concept. From what impression, what actual sensory experience, does this idea derive? If no experience can be pointed to, the idea is empty, and substance fails this test completely. Consider what happens when you look at a billiard ball. You see whiteness, roundness, and smoothness. You feel hardness and coolness. Where among these experiences is the substance? Nowhere. You experience only the qualities, bundled together in a reliable pattern. The substance is not an experience, it is a habit of thought, the assumption that something must underlie the bundle. Hume extended this critique to the self. You might think that at least you are a substance, a single, continuing thing that has experiences. But when you look inward, what do you find? A rushing stream of perceptions, feelings, thoughts and sensations, none of which is the self. You find only the bundle, never the owner of the bundle. The self, like material substance, is a fiction generated by the habit of connecting related experiences. Hume also attacked causation, which every previous ontology had relied on without question. When one billiard ball strikes another and the second moves, we say the first caused the second to move. But what do we actually observe? One ball moves, it contacts the second ball, and then the second ball moves. We see sequence and contact. We never see the causal power itself, the invisible force that supposedly makes one event produce another. Causation, Hume argued, is another habit of expectation, not a feature of reality we directly observe. You encounter Hume's skepticism about substance every time you interact with a modern data model. A user profile in a software system is nothing but a bundle of attributes: name, age, preferences, history. There is no hidden user substance beneath the data fields. The profile is the bundle. If you delete all the attributes, there is no residual entity left over. Software designers, whether they know it or not, adopted Hume's bundle theory as standard practice. The empiricist attack left ontology in ruins. Substance, causation, and even the self had been exposed as possible fictions. If these arguments stood, then ontology, as traditionally practiced, was impossible. We had no access to the deep structure of reality, only to patterns in our experience. It took a thinker of extraordinary systematic ambition to rebuild ontology from these ruins, and the rebuilding took a form no one expected. Part 12. Kant turns ontology inside out. The empiricists had stripped away substance, causation, and the self as fictions beyond experience. The rationalists, from Descartes through Leibniz, had built elaborate ontologies through pure reasoning. Immanuel Kant, writing in late 18th century Prussia, saw that both sides were partly right and wholly incomplete. His solution did not merely adjust ontology, it reversed the direction of the entire enterprise. Kant began with the fact that Hume's skepticism could not explain. Science works. Newton's physics made precise, reliable predictions about the behavior of physical objects. If causation were merely a psychological habit with no grounding in reality, as Hume argued, this success would be a miracle. But Kant did not return to the rationalist claim that we can know substances and essences through pure thought. He took a third path. The key insight was a reversal of the assumed relationship between mind and world. Previous ontology asked, what is the world like, and how does the mind come to know it? Kant asked the opposite. What must the mind contribute to experience for experience to be possible at all? Consider what it takes to have any experience of an object. You see a coffee cup on a desk. For that perception to count as an experience of an object, rather than a chaotic spray of sensory data, your mind must already be organizing the data into spatial relationships, temporal sequences, and causal connections. You experience the cup as occupying space, persisting through time, and being the kind of thing that can cause effects. It can break if you drop it, burn if you fill it with hot coffee. Kant argued that space, time, and causation are not features we discover in the world. They are structures that the mind imposes on raw sensory input to make experience possible. Without these structures, there would be no experience at all, just meaningless noise. The mind does not passively receive reality. It actively shapes the raw material of sensation into an organized world of objects and events. This had a shattering consequence for ontology. If space, time, and causation are contributed by the mind, then what we experience is the world as structured by our cognitive apparatus. Kant called this the world of appearances, or phenomena. The world as it is in itself, independent of our mental structuring, he called the world of things in themselves, or noumena. We can never know the noumenal world directly, because every act of knowing applies the very structures that separate us from it. Traditional ontology claimed to describe reality as it is in itself, the real natures of substances, the true structure of being. Kant argued that this project is impossible. We are locked inside our own cognitive framework. We can describe the structure of experience with extraordinary precision, but we cannot step outside experience to check whether it matches reality independently. This does not mean anything goes, or that the world is a dream. Kant was adamant that the structures of experience are necessary and universal. Every rational being must experience objects in space and time governed by causal laws. This gives science its objectivity, not because it describes things in themselves, but because the structures it relies on are shared by every possible experience. You can see Kant's move operating in a modern neuroscience lab. A researcher studying colour vision knows that the colours you see do not exist as such in the physical world. Light has wavelengths, but the experience of redness is constructed by your visual system. Different species with different visual systems literally see different colour worlds. The structure of experience depends on the structure of the experiencing apparatus. Kant generalized this insight from colour to all of experience: space, time, objects, causes, everything. But Kant left a massive loose end dangling. If we can never know things in themselves, why believe they exist at all? Kant insisted they must exist as the source of our sensory input. Something must cause our experiences even if we cannot know what it is. But he had also argued that causation is a structure contributed by the mind. Applying causation to things in themselves uses the very tool that is supposed to be limited to the world of appearances. Kant seemed to be violating his own rules. This contradiction, using the mind's own categories to posit something beyond the mind's reach, provoked the next great revolution in ontology. A thinker who started as Kant's most devoted student would try to close this gap by making an even more radical move. Part 13. Hegel and the Ontology of Becoming. Kant had drawn a hard line between what we can know, the structured world of appearances, and what we cannot, things as they really are. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, writing in the early 19th century in Germany, thought this line was incoherent. His objection was precise. To draw a boundary, you must be able to see both sides of it. If you truly could not access things in themselves, you could not even formulate the concept of a limit to your knowledge. The very act of saying we cannot know reality as it is presupposes some grasp of what that reality would be like. This was not merely a logical quibble. It led Hegel to dismantle the entire Kantian framework and rebuild ontology from a startling premise. The structure of thought and the structure of reality are not separate things. They are the same structure, developing through the same process. To understand what this means, start where Hegel started, with the most basic concept in ontology, pure being. Think of being stripped of every determination, every quality, every distinction, being with no content at all. What do you have? Nothing in particular, nothing you can point to or describe, nothing that distinguishes itself from anything else. In other words, pure being, when you actually try to think it, turns out to be indistinguishable from pure nothing. But pure nothing is not simply empty. The moment you try to think nothing, you are thinking something, the concept of nothing. So nothing flips back toward being. You cannot hold either concept in isolation. Each one, when thought rigorously, passes over into its opposite. What emerges from this unstable oscillation between being and nothing is a third concept, becoming. Becoming is the movement from being to nothing and from nothing to being. It is not a third thing added from outside. It is what being and nothing produce when you think them through honestly. The first ontological category for Hegel is not a thing or a substance, but a process, a dynamic movement of thought and reality unfolding together. This pattern, a concept generating its opposite, and both being resolved in a higher synthesis, is what Hegel called the dialectic, and he applied it to everything. Each concept, when fully developed, reveals an internal contradiction that drives thought toward a richer, more adequate concept. The whole of reality is this process of self-development, moving through contradiction toward greater completeness. This is why Hegel rejected the idea of a fixed ontology, a static list of categories that reality falls neatly into. Reality is not a set of things. Reality is the process by which things come to be, develop internal tensions, and transform into something new. Being is not a state. Being is becoming. Here is where you have already encountered this structure without recognizing it. Think about how a scientific theory develops. Newton's mechanics works beautifully for everyday objects, but generates contradictions at very high speeds. Those contradictions are not errors to be patched. They are internal tensions in the theory that force thought forward to relativity. Relativity does not simply replace Newton. It preserves what was true in Newton while resolving the contradiction at a higher level. This is dialectical movement in practice. Each stage of understanding is both overcome and preserved in the next. Hegel called this process Geist, sometimes translated as spirit or mind, working itself out through history. History is not a random sequence of events. It is the unfolding of reason, moving through contradiction toward greater self-awareness. Ontology for Hegel is not a timeless snapshot of what exists. It is the logic of how reality develops. The ambition here is staggering, and so are the objections. Critics have charged that Hegel's system is unfalsifiable. You can always reinterpret any contradiction as a dialectical moment rather than a refutation. The claim that thought and reality share the same structure looks like idealism, the view that reality is ultimately mental, and many have taken Hegel to be saying exactly that. Whether he was or whether he was making a more subtle point about the inseparability of concept and object remains genuinely contested. Hegel's ontology was so totalizing that reaction against it was inevitable. But the next major challenge to traditional ontology came not from someone who rejected Hegel outright. It came from a thinker who took the analysis of experience in a completely different direction, toward the structures of consciousness itself. Part 14. Husserl and the structures of what appears. Hegel had tried to unify thought and reality into a single self-developing system. By the late 19th century, many philosophers felt this was too speculative, too removed from what we actually experience. Edmund Husserl, a mathematician turned philosopher working in Germany and Austria, wanted to return philosophy to something more rigorous. His question was deceptively modest. Can we describe the structure of experience itself exactly as it presents itself without adding any theories about what lies behind it? The key problem Husserl started from was this. Both the empiricists and the scientists of his era treated experience as a series of raw sensory inputs, colours, sounds, pressures, that the brain somehow assembles into objects. But that is not what experience is actually like. When you see a coffee cup, you do not first see a brown patch, then a curved shape, then a handle form, and then construct cup from these pieces. You see a cup immediately as a whole, already loaded with meaning. The meaningful object is what you encounter first, not last. Husserl coined a term for this already meaningful directedness of experience: intentionality. Every conscious experience is an experience of something. You do not just see, you see a cup. You do not just fear, you fear something specific. Consciousness is always aimed at an object. This directedness is not something added to consciousness. It is what consciousness is. The ontological move here is subtle but powerful. Husserl was not claiming that the physical cup causes your experience of it. He was not denying it either. He was setting aside all questions about what exists behind experience: physical matter, brain states, Kantian things in themselves, and focusing exclusively on the structure of what shows up within experience. He called this methodical setting aside the phenomenological reduction. Once you perform this reduction, you can study the structures that make experience possible with extraordinary precision. Husserl found that objects appear to consciousness not as flat snapshots, but as laden with horizons. When you see the front of a building, you experience the building as having a backside, even though you cannot see it right now. The unseen back is part of how the building presents itself to you. It is co-intended along with the visible front. If someone sliced the building in half and removed the back, you would not just see a different building. Your entire experience of what was in front of you would collapse. This structure of horizons means that every experience contains more than what is strictly given in sensation. Consciousness is constantly projecting beyond the immediately present toward what could be given, what has been given before, and what is expected next. An object is never fully given in a single perception. It unfolds through time, revealing new aspects as you move around it, handle it, examine it from different angles. The ontological payoff was what Husserl called formal ontology, the study of the necessary structures that any possible object must have, regardless of whether that object is physical, mental, mathematical, or fictional. For example, any object must have properties. Any property must belong to some object. Any whole must have parts that relate to each other in specific ways. These are not empirical discoveries about this or that thing. They are structural laws governing the very possibility of objecthood. You can see this approach at work in modern user interface design. A well-designed interface is not just a collection of pixels on a screen. It is structured so that each element already points beyond itself. A button implies an action, a grayed-out field implies a condition, a loading bar implies a process with a beginning and an end. Interface designers, whether they know the word or not, are doing phenomenology. They are structuring experience so that the user's intentionality, the directedness of their attention and expectation, is guided toward meaning without explicit instruction. Husserl opened a vast new territory for ontological investigation, the structures of appearance itself. But his most famous student would accuse him of not going far enough. Husserl had studied the structures of consciousness directed at objects. His student would argue that this still assumed a subject standing apart from the world, examining it from a distance. The real ontological question, he claimed, was deeper than consciousness, deeper than subjects and objects, deeper than any framework philosophy had yet reached. Part 15. Heidegger and the Forgotten Question. Husserl had revealed the structures of experience with extraordinary rigour. But Martin Heidegger, his most gifted student, saw a problem buried at the foundation of Husserl's entire project. Husserl still began from consciousness, a subject directing attention toward objects. But where did this subject come from? How did the very distinction between subject and object arise? Heidegger argued that this distinction was not a starting point, but something that itself required explanation. His deeper claim was that the entire Western philosophical tradition, from Parmenides through Husserl, had made the same mistake. It had asked about beings, particular things that exist, whether physical objects, mental states, or abstract forms. But it had forgotten to ask about being itself, the condition that makes it possible for there to be any beings at all. This is what Heidegger called the ontological difference, the distinction between beings, the things that exist, and being the fact or event of their existing. To see the force of this distinction, consider a concrete case. A marine biologist dives to the floor of the ocean and catalogues every organism living there. She records fish, corals, worms, bacteria, an exhaustive list of beings. But when she has finished the catalogue, she has not captured one thing: the ocean itself. The ocean is not another item on the list. It is the medium in which all the items appear, the condition that makes the entire list possible. Heidegger's claim was that philosophy had been cataloguing fish for 2,000 years while ignoring the ocean. To pursue this forgotten question, Heidegger could not start from consciousness, or from substance, or from any traditional category. He needed to find an access point to being itself. And he found it in the one being for whom being is an issue, the human being. Not as a rational subject or a bundle of perceptions, but as a being that already finds itself thrown into a world it did not choose, caring about its own existence, projecting itself toward a future that includes its death. He called this kind of being Dasein, a German word that literally means being there. Dasein is not a mind inside a body looking out at a world. Dasein is its involvement with the world. Before you ever consciously reflect on an object, you are already using tools, navigating spaces, relating to other people, understanding situations. When you reach for a doorknob, you do not first perceive a brass-coloured cylinder, then infer that it is a handle, then decide to turn it. You simply open the door. The doorknob is encountered as something ready to use, embedded in a network of purposes and relations. Heidegger called this mode of encountering things readiness to hand. The mode of experience that previous philosophers treated as fundamental, the detached theoretical observation of an object, is actually a special derived mode that shows up only when something breaks down. When the doorknob jams, then it suddenly becomes a present-at-hand object you stare at and analyze. Theoretical contemplation is not the natural human relationship to being. It is what happens when practical engagement fails. This reversal has enormous consequences for ontology. If the detached theoretical stance is secondary, then ontologies built from that stance, lists of substances, categories of properties, subject-object structures, all describe a derivative mode of being, not the fundamental one. The fundamental mode is practical, embedded, concerned involvement. To understand being, you do not step back and observe. You notice what you're already doing before observation begins. Heidegger also argued that Dasein's being is shaped by temporality in a way no previous ontology had captured. You do not exist in time the way a rock sits in a river. You exist as time, as a movement from a past you are thrown into through a present you are engaged with toward a future that includes your own death. This temporal structure is not a feature of Dasein, among others. It is what Dasein fundamentally is. Being and time are inseparable. You experience Heidegger's analysis every day without naming it. When a carpenter reaches for a hammer, the hammer is not an object of contemplation. It disappears into the act of hammering, transparent, invisible, part of the flow of work. The moment the hammerhead loosens, the tool suddenly appears as an object. This shift from invisible immersion to visible thingness is the shift from readiness to hand to presence at hand. Every frustrating moment with a malfunctioning piece of technology reproduces this ontological transition. Heidegger's critique was devastating to the tradition, but it was also incomplete in a specific way. He analyzed how being shows up for the being that asks about it, for Dasein. But he struggled to complete the second half of his project, a description of being itself, independent of Dasein's perspective. His masterwork, Being and Time, published in 1927, was intended as only the first half of a larger project that was never finished. The question of being was reopened with unprecedented depth, but it was left suspended. Meanwhile, another branch of 20th century thought was developing a very different approach to the question of existence, one that bypassed the grand European tradition almost entirely and asked the question with the precision tools of modern logic. Before that story, one more thinker from the phenomenological tradition demands attention. One who took Heidegger's emphasis on human existence and gave it a sharp, unsettling edge. Part 16. Existence before Essence. Sartre's ontological reversal. Every ontology we have encountered so far assumes that what a thing is comes before the fact that it is. A horse has its nature, its essence, and then individual horses exist as instances of that nature. Even Heidegger, who shattered so many traditional assumptions, still analyzed the structures of Dasein as if they were given in advance. Jean-Paul Sartre, writing in mid-20th century Paris, made a move that reversed this entire priority. For human beings, he argued, existence comes before essence. To see what this means, contrast two things: a paper knife and a person. A paper knife is designed before it is manufactured. Someone conceives its purpose, cutting paper, and its form, a blade with a handle, before any particular knife exists. The essence precedes the existence. The knife is what it was meant to be. Now consider yourself. Were you designed with a purpose in advance? If there is no God, Sartre argued, then there is no designer and no prior blueprint for what a human being should be. You exist first, thrown into the world, conscious, aware, and only afterward do you make yourself into something through your choices. There is no human nature that precedes your decisions. You are what you make of yourself, nothing more and nothing less. Sartre grounded this in a specific ontological analysis. He divided all being into two fundamental types. The first he called being in itself, the mode of existence of things like rocks, tables, and paper knives. Being in itself is solid, self-identical, complete. A rock is simply what it is, with no gap between its reality and its identity. It has no inner distance from itself, no capacity to question what it is. The second type he called being for itself, the mode of existence of consciousness. Consciousness is radically different from a rock. It is always aware of itself, which means it is always at a distance from itself. When you reflect on your own anger, you are both the anger and the thing observing the anger. This gap, this internal distance, means consciousness is never fully identical with itself the way a rock is. There is always a nothingness at the heart of the conscious being, a void that separates you from any fixed identity. This nothingness is not a defect. It is the source of human freedom. Because you are never identical with any particular role, feeling, or situation, you can always step back and choose otherwise. A waiter in a cafe performs the motions of being a waiter, carrying trays, taking orders, adopting a certain posture. But he is not a waiter the way a rock is a rock. He is playing at being a waiter, and at any moment he could stop. To pretend that his role defines him completely, that he has no choice, is what Sartre called bad faith, a lie about one's own freedom. The ontological claim here is stark. Human consciousness is a kind of being that is perpetually incomplete, perpetually creating itself, perpetually free. And this freedom is not a gift or a privilege. It is a burden. Because nothing determines what you should be, the full weight of every decision falls entirely on you. There is no essence to appeal to, no cosmic plan to follow, no nature to fulfill. You are, as Sartre put it, condemned to be free. You encounter this ontological structure whenever someone faces a major life decision and says they need to find themselves. Sartre would say, there is nothing to find. You are not an object with a hidden essence waiting to be discovered like a fossil in rock. You are a process of self-creation, and the search for a pre-existing self is bad faith, the comforting pretense that the decision has already been made for you. But Sartre's ontology raises a serious difficulty. If human beings have no fixed nature, how do we account for the obvious patterns and regularities in human behavior? People are shaped by their biology, their upbringing, their social position. Sartre acknowledged these pressures but insisted they are never fully determining. You always retain the freedom to respond to your situation differently. Whether this claim is sustainable in light of modern psychology and neuroscience remains a genuinely open question. The compatibilist tradition in philosophy has tried to reconcile freedom with causal determination, but Sartre wanted something stronger, an ontological freedom built into the very structure of consciousness. The existentialist tradition pushed ontology toward concrete human experience with an urgency the analytic tradition rarely matched. But while Sartre was arguing in Paris, a parallel revolution in ontology was underway in the English-speaking world, one that traded existential drama for logical precision. Part 17. Whitehead and the Ontology of Process. Every ontology from Aristotle onward had taken things as the basic furniture of reality. Substances, objects, entities that persist through time and have properties attached to them. Alfred North Whitehead, a British mathematician and philosopher working in the early 20th century, argued that this entire assumption was backwards. The fundamental units of reality are not things, they are events. The problem that drove Whitehead to this conclusion came from physics, not from armchair speculation. By the 1920s, the classical picture of matter as solid, enduring stuff had collapsed. Quantum mechanics described particles that behaved like waves, that had no definite position until measured, that came into being and vanished in interactions. Relativity described a universe where space and time were fused into a single fabric that curved and stretched. The world physics revealed was not a world of things sitting in space. It was a world of happenings, of dynamic events woven into a web of relations. Whitehead took this seriously at the deepest ontological level. He proposed that reality consists of what he called actual occasions, brief, self-contained events of experience that come into being, achieve a definite character, and then perish. Each actual occasion is not a tiny thing. It is a moment of becoming, a process of integrating influences from prior occasions into a new unity. The word experience here is misleading if you hear it as referring only to human consciousness. Whitehead meant something much broader. Every actual occasion, down to the most elementary physical interaction, involves a kind of receptivity, a taking in of data from its environment and a creative synthesis of that data into something new. An electron interacting with a photon is an occasion of experience in Whitehead's sense. He was not saying electrons are conscious. He was saying that the most basic activity in nature, receiving influence and producing a response, is structurally similar to what we call experience at the human level. This is a radical move. It means that the difference between a rock and a mind is not a difference in kind, but a difference in complexity. Human consciousness is an extraordinarily rich and structured series of actual occasions. A rock is a comparatively simple and repetitive series. But both are constituted by the same basic type of event. What we call enduring objects, this table, that electron, your body, are not substances in the Aristotelian sense. They are societies of actual occasions, sequences of events that repeat a common pattern with enough stability to give the appearance of persistence. A candle flame looks like a single enduring thing, but it is actually a continuous series of combustion events, each one slightly different from the last, held together by the pattern they share. For Whitehead, everything is like a candle flame. You can see this framework operating in ecology and systems biology. A forest is not a collection of objects, trees, animals, fungi that happen to sit near each other. It is a web of ongoing processes: photosynthesis, decomposition, predation, symbiosis that continuously produce and sustain each other. The things in the forest are nodes in a network of processes, not self-sufficient substances. Whitehead's ontology treats this dynamic relational picture as fundamental rather than derived. The process ontology also offers a distinctive approach to the mind-body problem that plagued Descartes. If the basic units of reality already involve something experience-like, then consciousness does not need to emerge mysteriously from dead matter. It is an intensification of something already present at the most fundamental level. This position is sometimes called pan-experientialism, and it has attracted renewed interest among philosophers of mind looking for alternatives to both dualism and reductive materialism. But Whitehead's system faces serious objections. The claim that electrons have a rudimentary form of experience strikes many as unwarranted anthropomorphism. The framework is enormously complex and resistant to empirical testing, and the rejection of enduring substances makes it difficult to account for the stable, law-governed regularities that science depends on. Why do the actual occasions of a hydrogen atom always repeat the same pattern if there is no underlying substance holding them in place? Process philosophy remains a living tradition, but it has never achieved the dominance in Anglophone philosophy that substance ontology once had. Meanwhile, a very different figure was asking a question that would pull ontology in yet another surprising direction. A question not about what things are, but about the things that are not. Part 18. Meinong and the things that do not exist. Every ontology we have considered so far shares one assumption so obvious it barely registers as an assumption. The things ontology studies are things that exist. Alexius Meinong, an Austrian philosopher working at the turn of the 20th century, challenged exactly this assumption. His starting point was a simple observation about thought. You can think about things that do not exist, and your thoughts still seem to be about something. When you think about Sherlock Holmes, your thought has an object. You can say true things about Holmes. He lives on Baker Street. He plays the violin. You can say false things about him. He is a real estate agent. He lives in Berlin. The distinction between true and false claims about Holmes presupposes that there is something your claims are about. But Holmes does not exist, so what is the object of your thought? You might say Holmes is just a fiction, a character in a story, and leave it at that. But Meinong pressed harder. Consider a round square. You can think about a round square. You understand the phrase, you know what properties it would have to combine. Yet a round square not only does not exist, it cannot exist. It is logically impossible. Still, it seems to be an object of thought. It has properties, roundness and squareness, even though it is impossible. Meinong concluded that the domain of objects is much wider than the domain of existing things. Some objects exist, this table, that tree. Some objects subsist. They do not exist in space and time, but have a kind of standing, like numbers or geometrical figures. And some objects have no being at all. They neither exist nor subsist, but they are still objects in the sense that thought can be directed at them. The round square is an object without being. This gives you an ontological jungle of staggering richness. For every combination of properties you can think of, there is an object. A golden mountain has the properties of being golden and being a mountain, even though no such thing exists. The set of objects includes the existent, the merely possible, and the outright impossible. The immediate reaction from most philosophers was that this was absurd. Bertrand Russell, Meinong's most famous critic, objected that the theory leads to contradictions. The round square is both round and not round. It is round because roundness is one of its properties, and not round because being square excludes being round. A theory that tolerates contradictions, Russell argued, tolerates everything and explains nothing. Russell's alternative was to dissolve the apparent objects through logical analysis. When we say the golden mountain does not exist, we are not referring to an object and denying its existence. We are saying that there is nothing in the world that is both golden and a mountain. The sentence is really a claim about the world, that it contains nothing matching a certain description, not a claim about a mysterious non-existent entity. Apparent reference to non-existent things is a misleading feature of language, not a fact about reality. This dispute might seem purely technical, but it surfaces constantly in modern life. When a court considers a counterfactual, what would have happened if the defendant had not acted negligently, it reasons about a situation that does not exist. When an engineer stress-tests a bridge design by simulating failure conditions that never occur, the simulation is about scenarios without existence. Whether these non-actual scenarios are genuine objects of some kind, or merely useful fictions, or eliminable through clever rephrasing, is the Meinong-Russell debate in practical dress. Meinong's position was largely sidelined for most of the 20th century, but it has been revived in recent decades by philosophers who find Russell's eliminative strategy too restrictive. The question of how to handle the non-existent, fictions, possibilities, impossible objects, remain unresolved and feeds directly into several debates we will encounter ahead. The thinker who did the most to reshape ontology in the analytic tradition, however, was not Russell alone, but a student who pushed the logical approach even further, demanding that ontological questions be answered with the rigour of science. Part 19. Quine and the Analytic Revival of Ontology. By the mid-20th century, ontology had a reputation problem in the English-speaking philosophical world. The logical positivists, a movement centred in Vienna in the 1920s and 1930s, had argued that most traditional metaphysical questions were not false but meaningless. Asking what is being was, on their view, like asking what colour is Tuesday, a grammatically correct sentence that fails to say anything that could be tested or verified. Willard Van Orman Quine, an American logician and philosopher, rescued ontology from this dismissal, but on strict terms. He agreed with the positivists that ontology could not be conducted through vague speculation about the nature of being. But he showed that a perfectly precise version of the ontological question could be posed using the tools of modern logic. Quine's key move was to connect ontology to the structure of our best scientific theories. Here is how the argument works. Every scientific theory makes claims about the world using statements that can be translated into the language of formal logic. In formal logic, to say that something exists is to say that a variable ranges over it in a true statement. If our best physics says there exist particles with a certain property, then our ontology must include those particles. If our best mathematics, indispensable to physics, says there exist numbers, then our ontology must include numbers too. Quine compressed this into a slogan. To be is to be the value of a variable. What exists is whatever our best theories require us to quantify over, to say there is an X such that, in order for those theories to come out true. This is a powerful move because it transforms ontological disputes from cloudy debates about the nature of being into precise disagreements about what our best theories commit us to. You want to know if numbers exist? Check whether our best scientific theories can be stated without referring to numbers. If they cannot, if mathematics is genuinely indispensable to physics, then numbers are part of our ontology. Quine also demolished a distinction that many philosophers relied on to avoid ontological commitment. Rudolf Carnap, one of the leading positivists, had argued that there are two kinds of existential questions. Internal questions ask about existence within a given framework. Do prime numbers greater than 100 exist within mathematics? External questions ask whether the framework itself corresponds to reality. Do numbers really exist? Carnap said only internal questions are meaningful. External questions are mere decisions about which language to adopt. Quine rejected this distinction. There is no sharp line, he argued, between choosing a language and making claims about reality. When you adopt a theory that quantifies over numbers, you are committing to their existence, period. There is no safe space from which you can use numbers without believing in them. Every theoretical choice is an ontological commitment. You live inside this framework every time you rely on software built on a data model. A weather prediction system quantifies over pressure fronts, wind vectors, and moisture gradients. These are the entities the model says exist. If the model works, if it predicts accurately, then you have a pragmatic reason to accept those entities into your ontology. Quine treated all of science exactly this way, as a vast web of interconnected claims, where ontological commitments are determined by what the web as a whole needs to be true. But Quine's approach has a striking consequence that many find troubling. It ties ontology entirely to our current best theories. If those theories change, our ontology changes with them. There is no theory-independent fact about what exists, or if there is, we have no access to it. Ontology becomes a branch of science, revisable and fallible, rather than a discipline that reaches bedrock truths about reality. Whether this is a feature or a defect depends on what you think ontology should be. Some philosophers embrace the naturalistic humility of tying ontology to science. Others insist that the question of what exists must have answers that go deeper than whatever theory happens to be fashionable. This tension between ontological realism and ontological pragmatism runs through every debate that follows. Part 20. Properties, Universals and Tropes. The medieval war over universals never ended. It migrated into 20th century analytic philosophy and became, if anything, more technically precise and more fiercely contested. The central question remained, when two things share a feature, when this rose and that fire truck are both red, what accounts for the sharing? Three competing positions dominate the contemporary debate. The first is realism about universals, defended with particular force by the Australian philosopher David Armstrong in the late 20th century. Armstrong argued that universals are real, mind-independent entities that exist wherever they are instantiated. The redness of this rose and the redness of that fire truck are literally the same entity. One universal, redness, fully present in both locations simultaneously. Armstrong grounded this in the requirements of science. When physics discovers that all electrons have the same charge, this is not a coincidence or a generalization from habit. It reflects a real shared nature, the universal of having that specific charge that is identical in every electron. Without real universals, Armstrong argued, the regularities that science discovers are cosmic accidents rather than reflections of genuine structure in the world. The second position is nominalism, updated from its medieval roots, but driven by the same instinct. Nominalists argue that only particular things exist. When two roses are both red, the explanation is not a shared universal, but a relation of resemblance between the two particulars. They look alike, and we apply the same word to both, but there is no third entity, redness itself, sitting in both roses. The advantage of nominalism is ontological economy. You do not need to populate your reality with a vast inventory of abstract universals alongside concrete things. The disadvantage is the problem of resemblance. If two things resemble each other, what makes the resemblance relation hold? Is resemblance itself a universal? If so, the nominalist has smuggled universals back in through the side door. If not, the nominalist owes an explanation of what resemblance is and why it tracks the patterns it does. The third position is trope theory, which has gained significant ground in recent decades. A trope is an individual, particular instance of a property. The redness of this specific rose is a trope. It exists only in this rose and nowhere else. The redness of the fire truck is a different trope, numerically distinct, though qualitatively similar. There is no universal redness hovering above them both. There are only particular rednesses, and we group them together because they resemble each other. Trope theory tries to split the difference between realism and nominalism. Like the realist, the trope theorist says properties are real things in the world, not just words or mental habits. Like the nominalist, the trope theorist denies that universals exist as single entities present in multiple locations. The result is an ontology of particular properties rather than universal ones. You can see the practical stakes of this debate in machine learning. When an image classifier learns to recognize cats, it must determine what features are shared across all cat images. Does it learn a universal catness that each image instantiates? Does it learn a set of resemblance relations between particular images? Or does it learn to cluster particular features, individual trope-like data points, that are similar enough to group? Different architectures embody different ontological assumptions about what property sharing actually is, and those assumptions affect how well the system generalizes to new cases. The universals debate connects directly to a broader question that has proven equally resistant to resolution: whether objects that are not physical, not spatial, and not temporal can be said to exist at all. Part 21. Do numbers exist? The problem of abstract objects. You cannot trip over the number 7. You cannot photograph it, weigh it, or put it in a jar. Yet mathematicians make claims about numbers that seem to be objectively true or false, regardless of what anyone thinks. The statement that there are infinitely many prime numbers is not a matter of opinion, cultural convention, or scientific theory that might be revised. It appears to be true in a way that is completely independent of human minds and physical reality. This creates an acute ontological puzzle. If numbers do not exist in space and time, and they do not depend on anyone thinking about them, then what are they? And how do we know anything about them, given that all our knowledge seems to come from causal interaction with the things we know about? The strongest form of realism about abstract objects is mathematical Platonism, named after Plato's theory of forms for obvious structural reasons. Platonists hold that numbers, sets, and mathematical structures exist in a realm that is non-physical, non-temporal, and fully objective. When a mathematician proves a theorem, she is discovering a fact about this realm, not inventing one. Mathematical truth is independent of human activity in the same way that a mountain is independent of the climbers on it. The 20th century logician Kurt Gödel was one of the most prominent defenders of this view. He argued that mathematicians have something analogous to perception, a mathematical intuition that gives them direct access to abstract objects. Just as your eyes give you access to physical objects, your mathematical intuition gives you access to sets and numbers. The problem with this position is immediate and severe. It is called the epistemological access problem. Physical perception works through causal chains. Light bounces off an object, enters your eye, stimulates neurons, and produces an experience. But abstract objects, by definition, are causally inert. They do not emit anything, reflect anything, or interact with anything physical. If they have no causal power, how can they make any difference to what goes on in your brain? And if they make no difference to your brain, how can you have knowledge of them? This challenge was sharpened into a famous argument by the philosopher Paul Benacerraf in 1973. He argued that any adequate account of mathematics must satisfy two conditions simultaneously. First, it must explain why mathematical statements are objectively true. Second, it must explain how human beings can come to know these truths. Platonism does well on the first condition, but fails on the second. And rival theories tend to do the reverse. They explain our access to mathematics, but at the cost of making mathematical truth subjective or conventional. Nominalist alternatives deny that abstract objects exist and try to account for mathematical truth without them. One strategy, developed by Hartree Field in the 1980s, argues that mathematics is useful fiction. It does not describe real entities, but provides a convenient shorthand for making physical predictions. Field attempted to show that Newtonian physics could be reformulated without any reference to numbers at all. If he is right, then mathematics is dispensable in principle, even if it is enormously convenient in practice. This connects to an experience you have already had without thinking about it ontologically. When you use money to buy a coffee, you interact with numbers constantly. Prices, quantities, balances. Do those numbers exist the way the coffee cup does? Or are they useful fictions that help coordinate behavior? Most people instinctively treat numbers as real when doing mathematics and as tools when going about their day. The ontological question is whether one of these attitudes is correct and the other confused, or whether numbers have a mode of being that neither attitude fully captures. The abstract objects debate has generated a particularly creative family of responses from philosophers who think the whole question might be misframed, who argue that you can talk as if abstract objects exist without actually believing in them. Part 22. Fictionalism, Ontology without belief. The debate over abstract objects seemed to force a choice between two uncomfortable positions. Either accept that numbers and sets exist in a non-physical realm you cannot causally access, or deny their existence and explain away the overwhelming success of mathematics. Fictionalism offers a third path. Use mathematical language without believing that its objects are real. The idea draws on a surprisingly simple analogy. When you read a detective novel and say that Holmes lives on Baker Street, you are not making a claim about reality. You are making a claim within a fiction. The statement is correct relative to the story without corresponding to any actual person or address. Fictionalism about mathematics proposes the same structure. When a mathematician says there exist infinitely many primes, this is correct within the fiction of mathematics without corresponding to entities in the real world. The Australian philosopher Mark Balaguer and, in a different version, Hartree Field, developed this approach with rigour in the late 20th century. The basic claim is that mathematical theories are useful fictions, internally consistent systems of claims that track patterns in the physical world without those claims needing to be literally true. Just as a map can be useful without being the territory, mathematics can be useful without its objects being real. This sounds clean, but the difficulties are immediate. The most pressing is what philosophers call the indispensability problem, originally pressed by Quine. If mathematics is indispensable to our best scientific theories, and we believe those theories are true, then we seem committed to the truth of the mathematics embedded in them. You cannot accept the physics, but reject the math that makes it work. To call the math fiction while calling the physics fact seems like selective belief, trusting a building while denying the existence of its foundations. Fictionalists have responses to this challenge. Some argue that the mathematical parts of scientific theories are merely instrumental. They help us calculate predictions but do not describe anything real. Others argue that the indispensability of mathematics is overstated, that in principle scientific theories could be stated without mathematical vocabulary. None of these responses has achieved anything close to consensus. Fictionalism has spread beyond mathematics to other contested ontological domains. There are fictionalist accounts of possible worlds, of moral properties, of theoretical entities in science, and of social constructs. In each case, the strategy is the same. Preserve the usefulness of the discourse while avoiding ontological commitment to its objects. You engage in something like fictionalism whenever you use a metaphor that you know is literally false, but find indispensable for communication. When an economist says the market wants lower interest rates, no one believes the market is a conscious agent with desires. But the metaphor is almost impossible to replace with a literal translation that is equally informative and compact. Whether this counts as fiction, abbreviation, or something else entirely is a version of the fictionalist question applied to everyday speech. The deepest objection to fictionalism is philosophical rather than technical. If the best explanation of why mathematics works so extraordinarily well in describing the physical world is that mathematical structures are real features of that world, then fictionalism pays too high a price for ontological economy. It explains away precisely the thing that most needs explaining, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, as the physicist Eugene Wigner once called it. Whether we accept abstract objects, reject them, or adopt a fictionalist stance toward them, one specific class of abstract entities has generated its own dedicated controversy. Entities that describe how things could be rather than how they are. Part 23. Possible worlds and the cost of taking them seriously. When you say that things could have gone differently, that you might have chosen a different career, that the coin could have landed tails, you are making a claim about possibility. But what makes such a claim true? In the actual world, you chose what you chose, and the coin landed the way it landed. The alternative did not happen. If truth requires correspondence to reality, and the alternative is not part of reality, what is a possibility statement about? Leibniz introduced the concept of possible worlds as the answer. A possible world is a complete way things might have been. For Leibniz, possible worlds were ideas in the mind of God. But in the 20th century, the American philosopher David Lewis took this notion and made the most audacious ontological claim in modern philosophy. Possible worlds are not ideas, not abstractions, not useful fictions. They are real, concrete, physically existing universes, just as real as our own. Lewis called this view modal realism. On his account, there is a possible world where you did choose that other career. In that world, a concrete flesh-and-blood version of someone very like you is living that other life right now. Our world is not ontologically special. It is just the one we happen to be in. The way our city is not geographically special just because we live here. We call it actual because we are in it, the same way we call our location here. This sounds extravagant beyond all reason, and Lewis knew it. He defended modal realism on the grounds of theoretical utility. Possible worlds provide the best available framework for analyzing necessity, possibility, counterfactual conditionals, properties, propositions, and a host of other concepts. A proposition is a set of possible worlds, the ones where it is true. A property is a function from possible worlds to sets of individuals. Necessity means truth in all possible worlds. Possibility means truth in at least one. This framework is enormously powerful and deeply unified. Lewis argued that the ontological cost, admitting infinitely many concrete universes, is worth paying because no rival theory achieves the same explanatory power without hidden costs of its own. Theories that treat possible worlds as abstract objects or as linguistic constructs or as maximal consistent sets of propositions all face technical difficulties that modal realism avoids. The objections, however, are forceful. The most immediate is the sheer implausibility of the claim. Most philosophers find it absurd to believe that every way things could have been is a way things actually are, somewhere. Lewis bit this bullet deliberately, arguing that intuitive implausibility is not a good guide to truth in metaphysics. A more technical objection concerns knowledge and ethics. If there is a possible world for every possible outcome, then every possible event happens somewhere. This seems to undermine the seriousness of ethical choice. Why work to prevent suffering if a world where the suffering occurs exists regardless? Lewis responded that we should care about what happens in our world, just as we care about what happens in our city, even though other cities exist. But many philosophers find this response insufficient. You already use possible world reasoning whenever you evaluate a counterfactual claim. When a doctor says the patient would have survived if treated earlier, the doctor is describing a possible world, one identical to ours except for the timing of treatment, and making a claim about what happens there. Whether that possible world is a real concrete universe, an abstract mathematical structure, or a useful fiction determines how seriously we should take the counterfactual. And how seriously we take counterfactuals affects law, medicine, engineering, and every other field that deals with what could have been. The question of possible worlds leads naturally to a deeper puzzle about time and existence. If there are possible worlds where things go differently, what about times? Does the past still exist? Does the future already exist? Or is only the present moment real? Part 24. The Ontology of Time. Does the future exist? You remember yesterday and anticipate tomorrow, but you experience only the present moment. This asymmetry, vivid presence flanked by memory and expectation, generates one of the most contested debates in all of ontology. Does only the present exist, or do past and future exist just as fully as the present does? The view that only the present exists is called presentism. On this account, there are no dinosaurs. Not just in the obvious sense that there are no dinosaurs walking around now, but in the deep ontological sense that dinosaurs are no longer part of reality at all. They existed, but they do not exist. The past is gone, truly ontologically gone, and the future has not yet arrived. The only things that exist are the things that exist right now. The opposing view is eternalism. Eternalists hold that past, present and future events are all equally real. The Battle of Hastings and the first human settlement on Mars are both real events, differing only in their temporal location relative to us. The present is not ontologically special. It is just the time we happen to be at, the way your city is just the place you happen to be. Eternalism is often called the block universe view because it pictures space-time as a four-dimensional block. Everything that has ever happened or will ever happen is already there in the block. Nothing comes into existence and nothing passes away. What we experience as the flow of time is not an objective feature of reality, but a feature of our perspective within the block. A third position sits between them. The growing block theory holds that the past and present are real, but the future is not. Reality grows as time passes. Each new present moment adds a new layer to the block of reality. The past is preserved, but the future is genuinely open, not yet determined, not yet real. The strongest argument for eternalism comes from physics. Einstein's theory of relativity shows that simultaneity is relative. Two observers moving at different speeds can disagree about whether two events are happening at the same time. If there is no absolute fact about what is happening now across the entire universe, then there is no absolute present. And without an absolute present, the distinction between what presently exists and what does not collapses. Many physicists and philosophers have concluded that relativity effectively requires eternalism. Presentists push back by arguing that relativity shows only that simultaneity is not empirically detectable from within the theory, not that an objective present does not exist. Some propose that there is a privileged frame of reference that defines a real present, even if no experiment can identify it. Others argue that the metaphysical question of temporal ontology cannot be settled by physics alone. You are already navigating this debate whenever you think about death. If presentism is true, then when a person dies, they are gone in the strongest possible sense. Their existence has been subtracted from reality. If eternalism is true, then the dead person still exists at the times of their life, just as a city you left behind still exists at the place you left it. Your relationship to a dead person on the eternalist view is more like a long-distance relationship than an absolute loss. The emotional and philosophical stakes of temporal ontology could not be higher. Each of these positions generates further puzzles about what it means for objects to persist through time at all, whether you at age 5 and you at age 50 are the same entity, and if so, what makes that true? Part 25. Persistence and Identity Through Time. A photograph of you as an infant and a photograph of you today show two strikingly different physical forms. Nearly every cell has been replaced. Your height has changed, your personality has developed, your memories are almost entirely different. Yet everyone says it is the same person in both photographs. What makes that true? This is the problem of persistence, and it has two leading answers that correspond to fundamentally different pictures of what objects are. The first answer is called endurantism. An enduring object is wholly present at every moment of its existence. You, all of you, not a part or a stage, exist at every time you are alive. You are a three-dimensional object that moves through time, maintaining your identity as you go. Change is real alteration of a persisting thing. The second answer is called perdurantism. A perduring object is extended through time the way a road is extended through space. You are not wholly present at any single moment. Rather, you are a four-dimensional entity, a space-time worm, and what exists at any given moment is a temporal part of you, a time slice. The infant in the photo and the adult reading this are different temporal parts of the same four-dimensional whole, the way two different sections of a highway are different spatial parts of the same road. The choice between these views has real consequences for how you think about identity and responsibility. Suppose a 20-year-old commits a crime and is sentenced at age 60. The endurantist says the same person who committed the crime is being punished. The perdurantist says the person's stage being punished is a different temporal part of the same four-dimensional entity, connected to the criminal stage, but not identical with it. Whether punishment makes sense depends partly on which ontological picture you adopt. The perdurantist view fits naturally with eternalism. If the block universe contains all of space-time, then a four-dimensional object stretched across time is a straightforward inhabitant of it. The endurantist view fits more naturally with presentism or with a dynamic theory of time. If only the present exists, there is no temporal dimension for you to be extended across, so you must be wholly present now. There is also a third position, the stage view, defended by philosophers like Theodore Sider. On this account, you are not a four-dimensional worm, but an instantaneous stage, a momentary entity. The stage that existed 5 minutes ago is a different entity from the stage reading this sentence. They are connected by a relation of temporal counterparthood, not identity. Strictly speaking, no object persists through time at all. What we call persistence is a chain of related but distinct momentary objects. You encounter the persistence problem in the practical domain of law and medicine every time a case involves bodily or psychological transformation. When a patient with severe brain damage can no longer remember their previous life, are they the same person who signed a medical directive years earlier? The answer determines whether the directive is binding. Hospitals, courts and families implicitly take positions on the metaphysics of persistence every time they face these cases. The question of what makes something the same entity over time is closely related to a question about what makes something a single entity at a given time, the question of how parts compose wholes. But before we reach that puzzle, there is a distinct ontological category that needs its own treatment, the category of happenings rather than things. Part 26. Events, Facts and States of Affairs. Ontology is usually presented as a study of things, objects, substances, entities that sit in the world and have properties. But much of what concerns us in daily life and in science is not about things at all. It is about what happens. A lightning strike, a chemical reaction, a declaration of war. These are events, and their ontological status is far from straightforward. The question is whether events are a separate category of being, or whether they reduce to something else. The American philosopher Donald Davidson argued in the 1960s that events are irreducible particulars. When you say that the short circuit caused the fire, you are referring to two distinct entities, the short circuit event and the fire event, connected by causation. These events cannot be reduced to objects or properties. The short circuit is not the same thing as the wires, and the fire is not the same thing as the burning material. Events are happenings, and they deserve their own place in ontology. Davidson's argument for this turned on a logical point about how we describe events. Consider two descriptions, the stabbing and the killing. If a single act of stabbing someone causes their death, then the stabbing is the killing. They are the same event under different descriptions. One event, two descriptions. This is structurally identical to how we treat objects. The morning star and the evening star turned out to be the same object, Venus. If events can be identical under different descriptions, they must be genuine entities that exist independently of how we describe them. An alternative approach treats events not as bare particulars, but as structured entities, states of affairs. A state of affairs is a combination of objects and properties. The cat being on the mat, the electron having negative charge. On this view, events are not mysterious extra entities. They are the holding or obtaining of certain configurations of objects and properties. The distinction matters in law. A court must determine not just what objects were involved in an incident, but what happened, what events occurred, and in what order. When a plaintiff alleges that one event caused another, the court needs to individuate events, to decide where one event ends and another begins. If the short circuit and the fire are the same event re-described, the causal claim becomes trivial. If they are distinct events, the causal claim is substantive. How you slice reality into events determines what causal claims are even possible. Facts introduce a further complication. Is the fact that snow is white the same thing as the state of affairs of snow being white? Some philosophers distinguish them sharply. A state of affairs can either obtain or fail to obtain, whereas a fact is a state of affairs that obtains. On this view, there are states of affairs that are not facts, namely the ones that do not hold in reality. Others reject this and argue that facts just are true propositions, or that facts are redundant. The world contains objects with properties, and calling this a fact adds nothing. The ontology of events also intersects with the philosophy of mind. If mental events are genuine events, and if they can be identical to physical events under a different description, then this provides a way of being a materialist about the mind without reducing the mental vocabulary to physical vocabulary. Davidson himself used this strategy, arguing that every mental event is identical to some physical event, but that mental descriptions cannot be translated into physical descriptions. The ontology of events, far from being an abstract curiosity, shapes what we can say about consciousness, causation, and moral responsibility. The next question follows naturally. If the world contains both objects and events, what determines when a collection of objects or events counts as a single unified whole rather than a mere heap? Part 27. Parts, wholes, and the puzzle of composition. You are sitting in a room with a chair, a table, and a lamp. 3 objects. But is there also a 4th object, the chair-table-lamp composite? Is there something over and above the 3 individual items that is the whole made of exactly those 3 parts? This question sounds trivial until you notice what rides on the answer. If any collection of things automatically forms a further thing, the whole composed of those parts, then reality is absurdly overpopulated. Your left shoe and the Eiffel Tower together compose an object. The collection of all atoms that are currently part of a living person named Maria and all atoms currently part of the Pacific Ocean compose an object. For every possible grouping of things, no matter how arbitrary, there is a composite entity. This position is called mereological universalism, and the most prominent defender of it was David Lewis. Lewis accepted these seemingly bizarre consequences because the alternative seemed worse. If composition is restricted, if some collections compose a whole and others do not, then we need a principled criterion for when composition occurs. And nobody has been able to provide one that is not either arbitrary or circular. The most discussed restrictive answer was proposed by Peter van Inwagen. He argued that composition occurs only when the parts participate in a life, an ongoing, self-organizing biological process. On this view, organisms are genuine composite objects, but tables and chairs are not. There is no table in the room with you. There are just particles arranged table-wise. This sounds absurd in the other direction, but van Inwagen embraced it with full philosophical seriousness. His argument was that every proposed criterion for composition, other than always or when there is a life, falls apart under examination. Physical contact cannot be the criterion, because a stack of papers makes contact, but we do not usually consider it a single object. Causal integration cannot be the criterion, because the boundary between integrated and non-integrated is vague, and ontology should not depend on vague thresholds. A third position, mereological nihilism, takes the austerity further. Nihilists argue that composition never occurs. There are no composite objects at all, no chairs, no tables, no organisms. There are only fundamental simples, arranged in various patterns. What you call a chair is a description of how certain simples are spatially and causally organized, not a reference to a further entity made of them. You encounter the composition question every time you argue about whether a team is more than its players, whether a corporation is more than its employees, or whether a nation is more than its citizens. If composition is universal, all of these are trivially true. The composite entity exists by default. If composition requires a special condition like life, then corporations and nations are not real composite entities. If nihilism is true, even the players themselves are not composite entities in the strict sense. The debate remains open because each position saves some intuitions at the cost of others. Universalism gives you too many objects. Restrictivism draws lines that seem arbitrary. Nihilism denies the existence of ordinary objects. No option is comfortable, and the discomfort is not a sign that the question is confused. It is a sign that our intuitions about what counts as a single thing are less coherent than we assumed. The composition problem concerns how things are built from parts. The next topic concerns not how things are built, but what they can do, and whether what a thing can do is part of what it is. Part 28. Powers, Dispositions, and What Things Can Do. Take a glass sitting on your desk. It is fragile. This means it has the capacity to shatter if struck with sufficient force. But right now, sitting there undisturbed, nothing about its observable state shows you its fragility. The glass looks identical to a hypothetical indestructible glass made of some advanced material. The fragility is a disposition, a property that manifests only under specific conditions, but is supposedly real even when those conditions are absent. The ontological question is, what is a disposition? Is fragility a genuine property of the glass, present even when the glass is not being struck? Or is fragile just a shorthand for a prediction about what would happen if you struck it, without corresponding to any real feature present in the glass right now? The first view, that dispositions are real, intrinsic properties, has grown into a major movement in contemporary metaphysics under the banner of powers ontology. Philosophers like C.B. Martin, George Molnar, and Stephen Mumford have argued that the fundamental properties of nature are not inert qualities, but active powers, capacities to produce effects. An electron's negative charge is not just a label attached to observed behavior. It is a real power, a capacity to repel other negative charges and attract positive ones, that the electron possesses even when it is not interacting with anything. This view has a deep consequence for how we understand the laws of nature. The standard account, associated with David Hume and his modern followers, treats laws as descriptions of regularities in what actually happens. Electrons always repel each other, and this regularity is the law. But the regularity itself has no explanation. It is just a pattern in the cosmic mosaic of events. The powers ontologist says this gets things backwards. The regularity exists because of the powers. Electrons repel each other because repulsion is part of what it is to be an electron. The law is not an external description imposed on passive matter. The law is a consequence of the intrinsic natures of the things involved. Nature does not obey laws the way citizens obey legislation. Things behave as they do because of what they are. The rival human view, most forcefully defended by David Lewis, denies that there are any such powers or necessities in nature. All that exists is the vast mosaic of particular events and properties spread across space-time. Laws are the simplest and most informative summaries of this mosaic, but the mosaic itself contains no power, no necessity, and no pushing and pulling. You can see this debate playing out in pharmacology. When a chemist says a drug has the power to lower blood pressure, the powers ontologist says this capacity is a real property of the drug's molecular structure. The Humean says the drug has a certain molecular structure, and it happens that in the actual world, every instance of this structure has been followed by lowered blood pressure. The first view says the drug will work because of what it is. The second says the drug will probably work because of what has happened before. In practice, both may agree on predictions, but the underlying ontology is fundamentally different. The powers debate connects directly to a broader question about whether the categories we use to classify things reflect divisions that are genuinely there in nature, or divisions that we impose for our own purposes. Part 29. Natural kinds are the categories in nature or in us. Water is made of 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to 1 oxygen atom. This is not something we decided or negotiated. Every sample of water throughout the universe shares this molecular structure. The kind water seems to be carved into nature itself, waiting to be discovered rather than invented. Philosophers call such categories natural kinds. The idea of natural kinds captures a powerful intuition. Some ways of classifying things are objectively better than others because they correspond to real divisions in the world. Classifying animals by species tracks genuine biological differences. Classifying animals by whether their name starts with the letter B does not. The first classification reflects the structure of nature. The second reflects an arbitrary feature of language. The strongest defense of natural kinds came from Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam in the 1970s, both working on the philosophy of language and metaphysics simultaneously. Kripke argued that names for natural kinds, water, gold, tiger, function as rigid designators. They refer to whatever has the underlying nature that our original samples had, regardless of surface appearances. If scientists discovered a liquid on another planet that looked, tasted and behaved exactly like water but had a different molecular structure, it would not be water. The kind is determined by deep structure, not by superficial similarity. Putnam reinforced this with a famous thought experiment. He asked us to consider a planet, twin Earth, that is identical to our Earth in every way, except that the clear, drinkable liquid in its lakes and rivers is not made of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, but of a completely different molecule. Residents of twin Earth call it water and use it the same way we do. Putnam argued that despite identical appearances and uses, their water is not our water. The word water on Earth refers to the substance with our molecular structure, and the word water on twin Earth refers to their substance. Meaning depends on what is actually out there in the world, not just on what is in the speaker's head. This has a direct ontological consequence. If natural kinds are real, then the world comes pre-divided into kinds, and successful science discovers those divisions. Classification is not projection, but detection. But the natural kinds picture faces serious challenges from biology itself. Species boundaries are fuzzy. Organisms shade into each other along continua of genetic variation. Horizontal gene transfer in microorganisms blurs the lines between supposedly distinct kinds. Many biologists argue that species are not natural kinds in the traditional sense, but historical individuals, particular unrepeatable lineages, or conventional groupings that serve pragmatic purposes. The challenge extends beyond biology. Psychiatric classifications like depression or autism group together symptoms that may have very different underlying causes. Are these natural kinds or pragmatic categories that will dissolve as our understanding improves? The question matters enormously for treatment, research funding, and patient self-understanding. If depression is a natural kind, there should be a common mechanism across all cases. If it is not, searching for a single mechanism is a category error that will waste decades of research. The natural kinds debate connects to one of the most rapidly growing areas of contemporary ontology, the investigation of what makes social categories real and how they differ from natural ones. Part 30. Social Ontology. What makes money real? You hand a cashier a piece of paper with green ink on it, and she gives you a sandwich. The paper has almost no intrinsic value. The cotton and linen it is made of are worth a fraction of a cent. Yet it functions as money, with the power to command goods, settle debts, and measure value. What kind of reality does money have? Money is not a natural kind like water. Its existence depends on human attitudes, agreements, and institutions. If everyone simultaneously stopped believing that the piece of paper had value, it would cease to be money instantly. It would still be a piece of paper, but it would no longer be a $20 bill. The physical object persists. The social object vanishes. The philosopher John Searle developed the most influential account of how social objects work. His key concept is the constitutive rule, a rule of the form X counts as Y, in context C. A piece of paper counts as money in the context of a functioning economic system. A person counts as the president in the context of a constitutional government. These rules do not describe pre-existing realities. They create new realities. Before the rule, there is no money and no president. After the rule is collectively accepted, both exist. Searle called these institutional facts, distinguishing them from brute facts. It is a brute fact that this object weighs 1 gram. It is an institutional fact that this object is a $20 bill. Brute facts exist regardless of what anyone thinks. Institutional facts exist only because enough people collectively accept them. But this raises a puzzle. If institutional facts depend on collective acceptance, and collective acceptance is itself a social phenomenon, then what prevents the explanation from being circular? Searle answered that collective acceptance of constitutive rules can be implicit and unreflective. You do not need to consciously think, I accept the rule that this paper counts as money every time you buy something. The acceptance is embedded in your habits, practices, and expectations. Social ontology extends far beyond money. Corporations, borders, marriages, property rights, legal systems, and social classes are all entities whose existence depends on human collective activity. None of them would exist in a world without human beings, yet they have real causal powers within our world. A corporation can sign a contract, own property, and be held legally liable. A border can determine whether someone lives or dies. These entities are not fictions or illusions. They shape human life with enormous force. The deepest controversy in social ontology concerns the relationship between social entities and the individuals who compose them. Methodological individualists argue that all social facts ultimately reduce to facts about individuals and their interactions. A market crash is just many individuals making many decisions. Holists argue that social entities have properties and causal powers that cannot be reduced to individual-level descriptions. A traffic jam has properties, length, duration, propagation speed, that no individual driver possesses. You participate in social ontology every time you use a word like "we" to describe an action taken by a group. When a country declares war, who exactly is acting? Not any single individual. No one person is the country. Yet the action happens. Resources are mobilized. Lives are ended. The ontological status of the acting group determines how we assign responsibility and how we understand political life. Social ontology has pushed philosophy to develop new tools for describing how reality is layered, how some things depend on other things for their existence, while still being genuinely real in their own right. This concern with layering and dependence is the subject of one of the most active research programs in contemporary metaphysics. Part 31. Grounding and the New Architecture of Reality. Traditional ontology asked a flat question. What exists? The answer was supposed to be a list. Substances, properties, numbers, events, or whatever your theory admitted. But this flat approach misses something crucial about how reality is structured. Not everything that exists is equally fundamental. Consider a traffic light turning red. There is a physical fact. Certain wavelengths of light are being emitted from the lamp. There is a social fact. The light means stop. Both facts are real, but they are not on the same level. The social fact depends on the physical fact in a way that the physical fact does not depend on the social fact. Change the wavelength and the social fact changes. Change the traffic rules and the wavelength stays the same. Reality is layered, and the layers stand in relations of dependence. Contemporary metaphysics has developed a concept to capture this layered structure. Grounding. One fact is grounded in another when the first holds in virtue of the second. The social fact that the light means stop is grounded in the physical fact about the wavelength plus the collective practices of a society. The fact that this act is wrong might be grounded in the fact that it causes unnecessary suffering. Grounding is a relation of non-causal explanation. It tells you what makes something the case, not what brought it about in time. The philosophers Kit Quine and Jonathan Schaffer have been central in developing grounding as a rigorous metaphysical tool since the early 2000s. They argue that the fundamental question of ontology is not just what exists, but what is fundamental. What grounds what? A complete ontology is not a flat list, but a hierarchical map, with the most fundamental facts at the bottom and the less fundamental facts depending on them. Grounding is distinct from causation, and the distinction matters. When you say the physical structure of the brain grounds the mental state of seeing red, you are not saying the brain causes the seeing. You are saying the seeing consists in or is constituted by the brain state. The relation is not temporal. Cause precedes effect, but constitutive. The brain state and the seeing happen at the same time. One makes the other the case. This framework provides a way to be a realist about higher-level phenomena, minds, social institutions, moral facts, without treating them as mysteriously floating free of the physical world. They are real, but their reality is grounded in something more fundamental. They are not identical to their grounds. The traffic light's meaning is not identical to its wavelength, but they are not independent of them either. You already think in terms of grounding whenever you give a constitutive explanation. When a doctor says a patient's fever is due to an infection, the causal story is about how the bacteria entered the body. But when the doctor says the fever just is the body's elevated temperature response to the infection, that is a grounding claim. It tells you what the fever consists in, not what produced it. Grounding is not without critics. Some philosophers argue that it is obscure, that we do not have a clear enough grip on what "in virtue of" means to build a rigorous theory on it. Others worry that grounding is really just a repackaging of older concepts like supervenience or reduction under a new label. Still others question whether there is a single unified relation of grounding or many different dependence relations that have been misleadingly lumped together. The grounding debate represents the cutting edge of a field that has been asking about the structure of reality for 25 centuries. But one question is even more basic than what exists or what grounds what, and that is whether ontological questions can be answered at all. Before we reach the frontier, we need to hear from traditions that approach the question of being from entirely outside the Western framework. Part 32. Ontology Beyond the West. Every part of this series so far has traced a single line, from ancient Greece through medieval Europe, through the rationalists and empiricists, through the Germans and the analytic tradition. This is not because ontology is exclusively Western. It is because the Western tradition happens to have developed the particular vocabulary and problem structure that now dominates professional philosophy. But other civilizations confronted the question of being with equal depth and reached conclusions that challenge Western assumptions at their foundations. In the Indian tradition, one of the oldest and most systematic ontological frameworks comes from the Vaisheshika school, dating to roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era. Vaisheshika proposed a list of fundamental categories: substance, quality, action, universal, particularity, inherence, and later, absence. This parallels Aristotle's project in striking ways, but with a critical difference: the inclusion of absence as a real category. Western ontology has overwhelmingly treated absence as the mere lack of something, not a genuine feature of reality. Vaisheshika treated the absence of a pot from a table as a real, perceivable fact about the world, an entity in its own right, not a mere mental notation of something missing. This is not just an exotic curiosity. The ontological status of absences and omissions is a live problem in contemporary Western philosophy. When a doctor fails to diagnose a disease and the patient dies, was the failure a cause of the death? If causes are events, and the failure is a non-event, an absence of action, then causation by omission is philosophically puzzling. The Vaisheshika tradition had a ready-made framework for handling this that Western thought took millennia to approach. The Buddhist tradition developed an ontology that went further still. The central Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination holds that nothing exists independently. Every entity arises in dependence on other entities and conditions. This is not merely a causal claim about how things are produced. It is an ontological claim about what things are. To be a thing is to be dependently arisen. Nothing has an intrinsic self-standing nature. The philosopher Nagarjuna, writing around the 2nd century of the Common Era, pushed this to its logical extreme. He argued that all things are empty of intrinsic nature. They have no essence that makes them what they are, independently of their relations. This doctrine, called emptiness, does not mean that nothing exists. It means that nothing exists in the way we ordinarily assume, as self-sufficient, independently real entities. Everything is relational all the way down. This resonates with certain strands of contemporary Western metaphysics, particularly structural realism, which we will examine shortly, and the process philosophy of Whitehead. The convergence is not accidental. When thinkers push hard enough on the concept of independent existence, the concept tends to dissolve, regardless of which tradition they start from. In the Chinese tradition, the dominant ontological framework was not substance-based, but process-based from the beginning. Classical Chinese philosophy, particularly in the Taoist tradition, treated change and transformation as the fundamental facts about reality, not as problems to be explained in terms of something static. The Tao, as described in the text attributed to Laozi, is not a substance or an entity. It is the dynamic pattern of generation and transformation that underlies all things, closer to Heraclitus's logos than to Aristotle's substance, yet more radical than either. There is also a significant tradition within various African philosophical cultures, particularly the Bantu traditions, studied by Placide Tempels, and later more rigorously by philosophers like Kwasi Wiredu and Ifeanyi Menkiti, that grounds ontology in the concept of vital force, rather than static substance. Being is not a fixed state, but a dynamic power that flows, increases and decreases. Entities are ranked not by what they are, but by the intensity of their vital force. This produces an ontological hierarchy very different from Western category systems, one organized by degrees of life force rather than by logical classification. These traditions are not presented here as exotic alternatives to the real work of ontology. They are presented because they independently identified problems and possibilities that the Western tradition missed or marginalized. The inclusion of absences in Vaisheshika, the elimination of intrinsic natures in Nagarjuna, the primacy of process in Chinese thought, and the vitalist hierarchy in African philosophy each represent genuine ontological insights that are now feeding back into global philosophical conversation. One of the most striking convergences between Western and non-Western ontology is the growing suspicion in multiple traditions that individual objects may not be the fundamental furniture of reality at all, that structure and relation may be more basic than things. Part 33. Structural Realism. When physics dissolves objects. For most of the history of ontology, The physical world was assumed to contain objects, particles, fields, bodies, whose existence was independent of each other and whose properties belonged to them intrinsically. 20th century physics undermined this assumption systematically. Start with quantum mechanics. In classical physics, two particles are always distinguishable in principle. You can label this one A and that one B and track them separately. In quantum mechanics, identical particles of the same type, two electrons for instance, are fundamentally indistinguishable. It is not just that you happen to lose track of which is which. The physics itself provides no fact of the matter about which electron is which. If the very identity of a particle is not a fact about the world, then the concept of an individual object starts to erode. The erosion deepens with quantum entanglement. Two entangled particles have a joint quantum state that cannot be decomposed into separate states for each particle. The properties of the whole are not built from the properties of the parts. Instead, the parts get their properties from the whole. This inverts the foundational assumption of substance ontology, which says that the properties of wholes derive from the properties of their parts. Structural realism is the philosophical response to these developments. It comes in two forms. The first epistemic structural realism, defended by John Worrell in 1989, says that we can know the structure of reality, the patterns, relations and equations, but not the nature of the things that stand in those relations. Science gives us the web of connections, but not the intrinsic properties of the nodes. The second, more radical version is ontic structural realism, championed by philosophers like James Ladyman and Don Ross. They argue that there are no nodes. Structure is all there is. The relations do not connect pre-existing objects. The relations are the fundamental reality, and objects are just stable patterns within the relational network. This is a dramatic ontological claim. The world consists not of things, but of structures. The analogy here is to a mathematical group. In group theory, the elements of the group are defined entirely by their relations to each other under the group operation. Take away the relations, and there are no elements. The elements have no identity outside the structure they belong to. Ontic structural realists say the physical world works the same way. Particles, fields, and space-time points have no intrinsic nature. They are what they are solely in virtue of the structural roles they occupy. You can see this logic at work in the development of modern particle physics. A particle, like the electron, is characterized entirely by a list of structural properties, mass, charge, spin, that describe its role in the equations of quantum field theory. There is nothing more to the electron than this structural specification. Ask what the electron is in itself, apart from its role in the theory, and the question seems to have no answer. The objections to ontic structural realism are substantive. Critics ask how there can be relations without relator, without things that stand in the relations. A relation between A and B seems to presuppose the existence of A and B. Defenders respond that this presupposition is a holdover from substance ontology, not a logical necessity. The debate remains active and unresolved. If structural realism is right, then ontology has come full circle in a surprising way. Parmenides posited a single, undifferentiated being. Structural realism posits a single relational structure. In both cases, individual objects dissolve. But where Parmenides reached this conclusion through pure logic, structural realism reaches it through engagement with our best physics. Whether the convergence is coincidence or insight is itself an open question. Before we reach the frontier of ontological research, there is one more layer to examine, the question of whether ontology itself is a legitimate enterprise. Part 34. Meta-Ontology. Can these questions even be answered? Throughout this entire series, we have been doing ontology, asking what exists, what the categories of being are, what is fundamental, what depends on what. Meta-Ontology steps back one more level and asks, are these questions genuine? And if so, how could they ever be settled? The worry is not new. We saw it in the logical positivists who dismissed ontological questions as meaningless. And we saw Carnap's distinction between internal and external questions, which Quine demolished. But the worry has returned in more sophisticated forms. The contemporary philosopher Eli Hirsch has argued that many ontological disputes are merely verbal. When the universalist says, there exists a composite object made of your shoe and the Eiffel Tower, and the nihilist says no such object exists, they may simply be using the word exists differently. The universalist uses a quantifier that ranges over mereological sums. The nihilist uses one that does not. Neither is wrong about the world. They are talking past each other because they speak different ontological dialects. If Hirsch is right, then a significant portion of analytic ontology has been an elaborate misunderstanding. Philosophers were not disagreeing about reality. They were disagreeing about language, while under the impression that they were disagreeing about reality. The response from philosophers like Theodore Sider is that not all quantifiers are equally good. Some languages carve the world at its joints better than others. The existential quantifier of our most fundamental physical theory tracks something real, the genuine structure of the world. Ontological questions asked in terms of this joint-carving quantifier have objective answers. The dispute is not verbal, it is about which quantifier carves at the joints. But this response raises its own difficulty. How do we determine which quantifier carves at the joints without already having a theory of what the joints are? The appeal to joint carving seems to presuppose exactly the kind of ontological knowledge it is supposed to ground. A different challenge comes from the philosopher Amy Thomasson, who has argued that ontological questions are answered not by investigating reality, but by examining the rules governing our concepts. Whether numbers exist, on her view, depends on whether the application conditions for the concept number are satisfied. These conditions are determined by our conceptual practices, not by a mind-independent ontological structure. If our mathematical practices license the assertion there are numbers, then numbers exist, and no further investigation is needed. This approach, sometimes called easy ontology, deflates the drama of ontological disputes by treating them as answerable through conceptual analysis rather than through deep metaphysical investigation. Its critics, including Sider and many others, argue that this gives up on what ontology was supposed to be. A genuine inquiry into the structure of reality, not a study of how we happen to use words. You are implicitly taking a meta-ontological position every time you react to an ontological debate. If you hear that some philosophers deny the existence of tables and your reaction is, "That is clearly absurd," you may be treating the question as verbal. They cannot mean what they seem to mean. If your reaction is, "That is wrong about the world," you are treating it as substantive. If your reaction is, "Who cares?" you may be a deflationist about ontology altogether. The meta-ontological debate has not been resolved. Some philosophers are convinced that ontological questions are among the deepest and most objective questions we can ask. Others are convinced that most of them are pseudo-problems generated by confusions about language. The honest position is that we do not yet know which camp is right, and the question of whether we can know is itself one of the hardest open problems in philosophy. With the tools, traditions, and challenges of ontology now fully laid out, we can survey the frontier, the open questions where the next developments are most likely to occur. Part 35. Ontology at the Frontier. 25 centuries after Parmenides declared that being is one and unchanging, the question he forced open is still not settled. But the terrain of the debate has been mapped with a precision that would have been unimaginable to the ancients. Here is where the frontier currently lies. The first open front is the relationship between ontology and physics. Quantum field theory, the most successful physical theory ever constructed, does not straightforwardly describe a world of objects. Fields, particles, vacuum fluctuations, and virtual processes blend into each other in ways that resist traditional ontological categories. The question of what quantum field theory is about, what its ontology is, remains deeply contested among both physicists and philosophers. The development of a quantum theory of gravity, which remains incomplete, may force a further transformation of our concept of space-time itself. If space-time is not fundamental but emergent, then the very stage on which ontology places its objects may dissolve. The second open front concerns information. A growing number of physicists and philosophers have proposed that information is ontologically fundamental, that the basic layer of reality is not material stuff, but informational structure. If this program succeeds, then the history of ontology would have moved from substance to process, to structure, to information, each step more abstract than the last. Whether this represents genuine progress toward the truth, or a progressive emptying of ontological content, is not yet clear. The third front is the ontology of consciousness. No current physical theory explains why subjective experience exists at all. This is what the philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. Some responses, panpsychism, dualism, illusionism, each carry starkly different ontological commitments about what the universe fundamentally contains. If panpsychism is correct, consciousness is a basic feature of reality at every level. If illusionism is correct, consciousness, as we conceive it, does not exist. The stakes for ontology could not be higher, and the evidence could not be more ambiguous. The fourth front is the ontology of computation and artificial systems. When a large language model produces text that is coherent, responsive, and contextually appropriate, does it instantiate any genuine mental properties, or is it a sophisticated pattern matcher with no inner life? This question is not just about artificial intelligence. It is about what kind of ontological category the mental belongs to and what physical arrangements can realize it. The answer depends on unresolved questions in the philosophy of mind, the ontology of information, and the nature of representation. The fifth front is mathematical structure itself. The physicist Max Tegmark has proposed what he calls the mathematical universe hypothesis. The claim that physical reality does not merely obey mathematical laws, but is a mathematical structure. On this view, existence and mathematical consistency are the same thing. Every consistent mathematical structure exists as a physical universe. This is modal realism for mathematics. Lewis's possible worlds rebuilt as theorems. Whether this is profound or incoherent remains a matter of sharp disagreement. The sixth front is the intersection of ontology with ethics and politics. Social ontology has shown that categories like race, gender, and disability are real in the sense that they organize human life and distribute power, even if they lack the objective mind independence of natural kinds. The question of how to honor the reality of social categories without treating them as natural or inevitable is one of the most urgent philosophical tasks of the present moment. Getting the ontology wrong has direct consequences for justice, either naturalizing oppressive structures or failing to recognize the real forces that shape human lives. What connects all these frontiers is a single recurring pattern. At every stage in the history of ontology, the question of what exists has turned out to be harder, more surprising, and more consequential than the previous generation expected. Parmenides expected being to be simple. It proved to contain an infinity of categories. Aristotle expected substances to be fundamental. They proved to dissolve under empiricist scrutiny. Kant expected ontology to be impossible. It was reborn through logic. The logical analysts expected ontology to be precise. Its foundations turned out to rest on unresolved questions about language and meaning. The one lesson that holds across every period, every school, and every tradition is this. The question of what exists is not one question, but a network of interlocking questions that reconfigure themselves every time one of them is answered. Each answer reveals new assumptions that were invisible before, and each new assumption generates new questions. Ontology is not a problem to be solved, but a discipline of permanent inquiry, one that deepens every time it seems to close. The question Parmenides asked 2,500 years ago is the same question a physicist asks when she stares at the equations of quantum gravity and wonders what they are about. Neither has an answer yet. The distance between them is not a failure. It is a measure of how far the question has taken us, and how far it still has to go.